I saw darling Corey. She was standing by my bed. Oh, baby, strapped on her backside. Pretty well gone tonight.
I'm so pleased to welcome today the illustrious Mark Laxer, who's just written his third book called Rama Trauma Trump, after having written Take Me for a Ride and the Monkey Bible. So, hey, Mark, what's going on?
Hey, Jen, thanks so much. Things are great. I'm up here in northern Vermont, and the weather's starting to turn, and few leaves are starting to turn red. It's my favorite time of year, and my birthday is coming up. And it's just a time for me, when the seasons shift like this, for reflection. And I'm doing a lot of reflecting lately. I've been doing a lot of reading of different newspapers and commentary, and it just seems that the whole nation is going through a kind of transition and reflective time.
It really does feel that way. And this newest book that you've just written, and it's kind of like a, what do you call it, an illustrated comic book? Or what do you call it? Rama Trauma Trump. It is a very reflective book because it takes where you've been, your experiences, and kind of pairing it with the political situation today. And a lot of it has to do with narcissism.
It does indeed. I guess I would think of it, first of all, I would call it nonfiction. I would call it a nonfiction graphic story. I'm not going to say it's a novel, because it's not a novel. It's as you say, Jen, it's kind of like a comic book. It's 32 pages. I almost think of it as a dear friend of mine who read it early on. He said, "This is a public service announcement, Mark." Mm-hmm. And that's how I see it, Jen. I think it's a public service announcement. And I think it's a PSA about narcissism, as you're saying. It's about powerful, charismatic narcissists in society and the effects they have on the people in society, and sort of making a parallel between a kind of a religious narcissist with a political narcissist.
Right. And we've got the narcissist in chief, of course, right now, Donald Trump. And hopefully he can get voted out of office. I was shocked that he even got into office, like so many people. But, hopefully this time round we can get him out of office. And
one of my concerns is that he will get unelected, but he will remain, or attempt to remain in power. And through his following, it just seems that people might do things that you would see in a banana republic. Mm-hmm. And there'd be some type of pushback against rule of law, because we've been seeing the rule of law being chipped away institution by institution over these past 3.5 or so years. So I would imagine he's not going to want to leave power. And that's in part why I'm working on this book and trying to share it, to try to help him get unelected, not just by a small margin, but by a large margin, because I think it will be harder for him to make bogus claims if it's a landslide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So going back to your book, do you want to tell us a little bit about it and the premise, and, kind of what it covers and what period of your life, and what your point is?
Sure. No, thanks so much. So it starts, it's autobiographical. It's actually, it's based on my first book. It's kind of like the graphic comic book version of my first book, Take Me for a Ride, Coming of Age in a Destructive Cult. This third one, the one we're discussing, is called Rama Trauma Trump. The subtitle is, I Left the Cult And now look what happened. So basically, Jen, in a nutshell, and I do realize it's kind of taboo, but it's not for me. I was in a cult. I joined a group that I thought was cool when I was 17 years old, and studied Eastern philosophy and mysticism and meditation, and mindfulness is the big buzzword now. All good things. The only problem is, in a lot of these groups and with these teachers and these new age like communities, there's wonderful explorations, but there's not a lot of checks and balances. And now I could say, oh, well, back in the good old days when you had these religions, traditional religions, there were a lot of checks and balances. But then you and I could look at each other and say, well, that's not true either. In some instances, or many instances, there are wonderful checks and balances built into religions. And we often see and read about when that did not work. So my story, which starts the beginning of the book, is about when I'm quite young, looking to explore the world and try to understand my place in nature. It's all about how a group didn't work. So the checks and balances didn't work. It was a new age experiment gone bad.
And narcissism is a funny thing, right? So it kind of can creep up on you. It's not like initially very obvious, and then as time goes by, it kind of creeps up if the leader of your group has that predilection. And it's almost like there's a need to be God, or a need to be the one. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think initially, one is surrounded by loving, interesting, colorful people. And there could be a strand of narcissism about the culty flavor of a charismatic leader. And certainly as a 17-year-old, and I know a lot of older people who have a lot more wisdom, they get pulled into that as well. And I look at Trump's following, that's certainly many, many millions of people, because they overlook that. They don't want to see it. They feel a sense of community, a sense of belonging. And it's actually very powerful and very wonderful to be in a group, to be in a tribe where we all share the same language and have similar dreams. And there's the them, and then there's the us. It's very exciting.
Oh, yeah. And the camaraderie, right? And the companionship, and, the adventures that you go on together, all of those things, right?
It's almost like a Quixotic quest. It's something from the Knights of the Round Table. There's something greater. I mean, that's how the book starts, is there's this young, kind of nerdy kid.
Yes.
Who was looking, Jen, for something more than what the New York Times said there was. The New York Times is great, but they're talking largely, not always, but largely about physical, factual reality, right? All the things that QAnon can't quite figure out. And it's exciting to go explore that which is beyond the rational. How did I get here? Well, the thing is, the physicists and the biologists, they come up with a lot of ways to describe reality, but they can't necessarily describe what we don't know and can't know. What's the origins of the universe? Is there a multiverse? What's beyond the multiverse? What's my place in nature? These are the things I was struggling with, or struggling. It was fascinating to me. It's a great journey.
Yeah.
I was so excited. And I thought that I should find a teacher to help me along the way.
Yeah. And that's a special time of life when you're a young adult, just getting out of your teenage years into your 20s. You're very, very open, and people who are they're predisposed to, explore these things or be seekers or whatever. They are probably extra vulnerable because you're ready to try anything and you don't yet have a family, you're not yet tagged down into the everyday kind of grind. And that's a really important time of life. And it's a time when a lot of people find themselves drawn into these groups, right?
I think that's right. And sometimes I think about it and I think, how could someone not join a cult? I know that sounds kind of bizarre and maybe backward the way, you know, a rational person would think, but how could one not explore the edges of the world around us? And that's sort of what a cult is. I mean, the thing is, there's a difference between, in my mind, between a cult and a destructive cult. A cult is something that is an idea or a person that people are intensely devoted to. I mean, that's the dictionary meaning. Mm-hmm. If we're going to go with that, I think many cults are quite benign. The cult of Gandhi is one I would sometimes mention, or the cult of democracy, or, you know, you read a great, but the cult of Harry Potter, that sort of thing. Or there's mm-hmm. like a really great movie that, you know, we all get into on so many levels. Mm-hmm. The destructive cult story is different.
Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, thanks. So initially you join one of these groups and it's so exciting, as I was saying before, and you feel accepted and people are attractive and you start to learn to speak a common language. And often the leader of these groups kind of gets sucked up into it as well as everyone else. And maybe they have a propensity to go overboard, to claim too much power. Maybe they have something internal, emptiness inside, or a loneliness, or something that comes out that's abusive.
Right. Or maybe they were predisposed to be in a cult in their younger years and they just kind of pass it along, right?
I think it might be something like that. And it's fascinating you say that. It's sort of like if one were abused, for instance, as a child, often those are the folks who kind of pass on the favor. Unfortunately, I mean, it's a sad story, and many, many millions of people are affected in a negative way this way. That is crossing the line from a cult to a destructive cult. And it's so hard to see where, like, what day, what year, what month, what moment did one's group, where one's favorite people, one's community, that like all the stuff one is fighting for and believes in and studying together, at what point does that cross over and become destructive and one should just leave? Or does one believe one should try to stay in it and try to transform it? I see that, again, I'm seeing parallels between my experience in a destructive cult in a New Age religious sense with the current political situation in the United States. So at what point, I read the papers every day and I'm like, at what point do the Republican followers say, I've had enough? Does it have to be that Trump makes a claim that all the people who lose a limb in fighting in the United States Armed Forces and they're losers and they're suckers? If he makes a statement like that, let's just imagine the president of the United States would say that veterans and, you know, people in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and the Marine Corps and so on, they're losers. Let's just imagine he say that. Would that mean the Republicans would leave him in droves? It turns out he said that. And I'm following the news, and even Fox News has pointed out that the Atlantic publication, which just, I think it was 2 days ago, came out with an article saying that that's what Trump has said, and Fox is backing it, if you can believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that today, or in early September, droves of Republicans will peel off because that's too much? The answer is no.
No.
But
Well, you get invested in an idea, and then the more you put into it, you just keep doubling down, and you lose your sense of your own values. You start to agree with things that you never would have agreed with before, and then you're sucked into it.
Yes, and I've recently read a kind of a long diary of a German Jew named Victor Klemper. He was a professor. It's his diary of the Holocaust, and he amazingly survived. Most of his community and friends were killed, and so you sort of wonder, like, the Gestapo all around him. At what point would they turn? They were very invested in the Nazi propaganda. Of course, if they turned, they would also be killed. So, I mean, there's a big incentive for them to stay inside the fold. But I think for a lot of them, it took the actual bombing of the cities by Russian and British and American forces for them to change their minds. What's going to change the Trump followers? Maybe nothing. Maybe they will see him as a great leader, and that's great. My concern with that is that it's destroying the United States as a democracy and as a world power, step by step. It's happening. It's happening now. And 4 more years of this guy, and this, you have to believe me when I say this. This for me is not Republican versus Democrat. It's not a red versus blue issue. I have my issues with the Republicans, but this is not that. I mean, a Republican gets voted in, I may disagree with them, but I respect their office and their, the fact that they got elected. And so I will happy to work with Republicans. A lot of my friends are Republicans. This is not that. This is something else.
Yeah, it really is. And what is scariest about it of all is how people are willing to put aside what they would normally think and their own values and just keep doubling down into this very scary man, and not backing away from those ideas, even when it's so obvious that it's toxic. This is a very, toxic, narcissistic personality disorder and then some, and yet people are still attracted to him, his base. And I have a hard time understanding that.
I find, yes, as do I. I find that I go back to thinking how I was able to leave a cult. And then I think about the followers of Trump and how difficult it must be for them to step back and say, oops, I was wrong. I made a boo-boo. I mean, certain policies like Trump, for example, like Trump is into cutting taxes. Fine, you want to cut taxes. That's a separate thing. That's not what I'm talking about here. This is something greater than that. And I found that one thing that helped me leave the Rama cult, I was going to say the Rama Trauma cult, was because I was an insider. And there was just a handful of us. I was going to say I was the right-hand man, but the reality is that's a misinterpretation, mischaracterization, because the women in the group always had more power than the men. But in terms of the men, I was the right-hand man for
Right.
some number of years.
Yes.
It's just, I'm not trying to brag, it's just how it was. And I got to see things, actually, now that I think about it, I was among three guys who were very, very close.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to see Rama abuse people. That really helped me to leave.
Yeah.
That was the thing that I would have thought that the Nazis in Germany in the leading up to the early 40s, if they saw people getting hurt, that's too much. There's something in the human psyche. I don't think it's the German people. I think it's something in our species. I don't think it's the German people. It's easy as a Jew. I'm a Jewish guy. It's easy for me to say, those freaking Germans, what they did. And I will say that. But that's not the bigger story here. I think all humans are capable of it.
It's amazing that you when you bring that up, because none of those people would have followed the Nazi agenda on their own, but it became kind of a social pressure situation, right? And it became a lot easier to stay in that rather than try and get out, and you would actually have to run away, because of the influence of the Nazi cult and all the different people and the leader and everything like that. So it's very difficult, very difficult. So what you did, it's very brave, when you came to that breaking point and you actually picked up and left. Tell us a little bit about that and what drove you to make that decision and then give you the strength to walk out that door.
I connected with a kind of innocent part of something that's in my heart. And it used to be, Jen, and forgive me, this sounds a little childish, but it was our rallying cry in the early years. This is kind of welling up my emotions here, but our rallying cry early on in our cult, before it really grew into what I would characterize as a destructive cult, it was something that we borrowed from Kermit the Frog. And it was, make millions of people happy. I never wanted to hurt people. I never wanted to take advantage of people. What is a destructive cult? It's this very, very, very steep hierarchy, but that's not me. It's deep, deep down. Like if you were to we don't eat and we don't sleep for days. We go out in the desert and, look at the stars and stuff and really take out the external surface level Mark Laxer stuff. I'm not, and what's left, for me, it's more peers. These are my friends. I care about people and I empathize and I love friendships where it's not all that hierarchical. And I think when I left, or when I wanted to leave for a while, but I had this conflict because I guess I didn't want to leave my friends.
That's the hardest part, isn't it? Because all of your social connections are within that group, and you're also taught to fear the outside world. And you're also taught that if you leave, something probably pretty bad is going to happen to you, and you're kind of admitting failure. And most of all, you're leaving all these people that you have some really deep connections with.
The deepest, absolutely. It was so hard. So I had this conflict within me of, what really ultimately helped me to leave was the realization that I'm okay. I'm not evil. I didn't join the group thinking I'm evil. I joined the group thinking, oh, we're going to make millions of people happy. I was so inspired by it. It was so sweet. And I believed it. Over the years, that turned into, I have all these negative things. Scientology does the same thing. And some religions do the same thing. They scare you with that which you cannot see. Ghosts, spirits, entities, zygons, and every group makes up their own names. People have big imaginations, so they start imagining these big, scary, hairy monsters, which are depicted in Rama Trauma Trump. I left the cult, now look what happened, by the brilliant artist Marcy Villette. She really captures the darkness and the humor and the gentle hopes and dreams of the journey. I'm so honored to, I was a writer. Marcy is the artist. She ended up, we worked together. We worked really well together, I think. I think she did a brilliant job. So it was this inside my heart, this conflict that made me so that I couldn't leave. But eventually I came up with two things. One is, I'm okay. I'm not evil. I'm not trying to destroy cities and, hurt people. I'm not this steep hierarchical person. So it was, I'm okay. And I reconnected with, Kermit, this kind of innocent, goofy, nerdy, happy-go-lucky guy that I always was. So that reconnection helped me to leave. And it was a tough journey.
Oh, I'm sure it was hugely tough. One thing that's kind of fascinating is the difference between when you're in one of these cults, being in the inner circle and being one of the general populace that comes to meetings. So in the inner circle, you are involved with the leaders' day-to-day activities. You've got a very tight friendship with other people in the inner circle, and you see different things that people who have a more kind of they don't have that experience. They might just see the leader in an auditorium or something like that. They're going to have a different experience. Can you talk about the challenges of being in the inner circle and what you see when you're in the inner circle as opposed to being part of the general populace?
I've run into many people who are in the Rama group who were off in the 23rd row of the Ebell Theater or whichever theater Rama was lecturing and teaching at, and they never got to hang out with the man. And they generally have a very positive view of him, which is great. I think it's more complex when you spend time with someone and you see the discrepancies between what they're saying publicly and what they're doing. And very few people saw Rama give people LSD and direct them while they were tripping on acid. Okay, so I got to see that. It wasn't all that pretty necessarily. And people think that's fake news. You're just making it up. Well, it's not. I wish it were. I'm not out to get Rama. I love the man. He was a close friend of mine, I thought. Quite the opposite. My first book and this book, I'm trying to bend over backwards to be kind and fair to Fred Lenz. That love is still there. And it's like you're in a marriage and someone deceives you and betrays you, and it breaks your heart and you end up leaving the marriage, but there's still some love there. So I just think that if you're in the inner circle, you're in a pressure cooker. The intensity of having to toe the party line keeps changing, to be a public face to the organization, it was so intense. And I think back in terms of my knowledge of history to Stalin. Stalin, leader of the USSR, he would kill his inner circle. He would kill them, literally kill them and cycle them. This is a way that leaders keep a very
Really
steep hierarchy.
I had no idea.
And what Rama did was, it's very interesting to see how autocratic, powerful, charismatic leaders deal with their inner circle. What Rama did was he'd cycle us. So he'd have 23 of us, and then he'd burn us out and he'd say, all right, you're leaving, or I'll see you in a year or two, or whatever. He wouldn't be quite polite like that, but he'd say all sorts of nasty things. And then he'd bring another 23 and then soak their money up and abuse them, and then bring back the old ones who are dying to get back in. He'd cycle us. He wouldn't murder us. Otherwise he would have ended up in prison. Yeah. It's interesting to see what Mr. Trump does with his inner circle and how they cycle through. And I think about Anthony Scaramucci and Mattis, General Mattis, and General Kelly. And I think about Kellyanne, who just stepped back, Kellyanne Conway.
Oh, did she finally?
She did, to be with family. I wonder if she's got another story to tell one day. I think it'd be very interesting, because she is in the inner circle, Kellyanne is, of a destructive cult. And she's going through what I went through. And my heart goes out to her. As much as she is hurting people and destroying the country, still, I empathize with her position. I don't agree with it. I think she's morally abysmal, reprehensible. I mean, it's just horrible what she's doing and what she's done. But on a personal, on a humane level, I'm not going to say I pity her, because she could write a book and get millions of dollars, and I'm sure.
And she's got a unique situation too, because her husband is definitely not in the Trump cult, and he has been very outspoken. I can't remember his name, but his last name.
George Conway. He's one of the founders and leaders, although he may have stepped back from it, of Project Lincoln. And he has been one of the harshest critics, or let's say one of the most effective critics of Donald Trump. He's a Republican, tried and true. I believe he's known as a conservative Republican. He's a super smart guy. He's a high-powered attorney in Washington, D.C., who is highly connected, and he is taking Trump apart as much as anyone could. Mr. Conway, hats off to you. I have a lot of respect for what you're doing. Yeah. And Jen, I'm not connected the way he is, and Rama was never Mr. Trump. Although I do see a lot of similarities as described in this free, my book is free, by the way. You go to ramatraumatrump.com and there it is, you get it for free, share it. I don't want money from it. But when I left, not that George Conway was ever in the cult of Trump, but I did what George Conway is doing now. I took Rama on because I mean, I didn't make money from it. In fact, I got sued $30 million to try to scare me and silence me, and try to squelch the sharing of my first book. But it felt like the right thing to do. It was reconnecting with, I don't want to see people hurt. I didn't want to see my friends hurt. I didn't want to see people I'd never met hurt. And I helped start this organization. I helped Rama rise to power, as did a bunch of other people. And I felt a responsibility toward educating the public. Fly east, fly west, go explore, but don't fly into the cuckoo's nest. I find it fascinating that so many of my dear, dear friends and people I've known for many years, they know as much as I do. And they're not talking. There's no warning to the public. They're very quiet about it. And I think the same about Trump, and probably the same thing about Nazi Germany. It's not a slight against my friends or the people I've met or haven't met. It's just an observation, Jen, of human nature. Mm-hmm. It's our species. This is what we do.
And you entered that when you were 17, and as you were in the inner circle, you were highly, highly indoctrinated. All of your friends, 100%, were wrapped up in this organization, and you were in it for about, what, 8 or 9 years or something like that?
7.
And when you left, you probably had a feeling like you didn't really know who you were. You had to discover who you were because you had been told who you were for so many years, and what to buy and what to think and pretty much everything, right?
Yeah. When I left, Jen, that was in 1985. I bicycled across the United States going east to west. Most people, when they bicycle across the country, they go west to east because that's the way the winds are going. They go with the wind. I went against the wind. I was feeling, I just wanted to experience the raw power of the United States as part of my healing. I needed a backdrop, a grand theater for reflection. Mm-hmm. So I bicycled and I found in the United States, this is slightly ironic, this whole story, everything we're talking about, because I found in my healing, when I bicycled from Massachusetts out west to follow the setting sun, I didn't have a map with me. I found in my healing not only a reflection of my own thoughts and reconnecting with my own heart, but the people in America in those mid states, the red states, the Trump country. These people were so kind and so generous. Mm-hmm. It was all part of the healing, to understand goodness and to step back from very, very steep autocratic slopes of a mountain where there's no checks and there's no balances. That's not how our nation is supposed to be. We're supposed to have 3 co-equal branches of government plus a media. And one by one, Trump is defusing, depowering anything except his royal self. Mm. That was not, my healing, my leaving the cult and going across the country, I slept under the stars. I wasn't like building an organization and declaring myself. I was just out there and just take all these steep hierarchy mythologies. Oh, Mark, Rama would say to me, you could attain enlightenment in this lifetime. This is like some deep mythology. I sort of bought into that. Or let's make America great again. Hey, people, why don't we make America good? Why don't we go back to our roots as a good nation where we don't hate Blacks, Hispanics, particularly and especially the Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, which get such short shrift these days, Asian people, Jews, veterans who've lost limbs, the Honorable Senator from Arizona, John McCain. Let's start respecting the people around us. Let's stop being great. Let's start being good again.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And you had a dog with you, didn't you? Didn't you get a Siberian Husky that you took on this bicycle trip? How did that work?
So I was planning to bicycle across the United States to do some thinking. That's a line from my first and this new book that's free on the internet, Rama Trauma Trump. I left the cult and now look what happened. I was not planning to go with a dog. And I was working as a software engineer in downtown Boston. And I was doing a lot of bicycling. I bicycled every day through the cold Massachusetts winter to work, to get in good shape. My boss bet me like, I think it was $5 I couldn't do it. And came the springtime, I came in, I said, you owe me $5. And anyway, I was going into a shopping mall at some point before the bike trip, and I just went into a little pet shop, and there's a little Siberian Husky puppy. And I looked at the Husky, and I wasn't planning to get a dog. And I grew up with dogs, so I'm a dog person. I also love cats. I love animals. I love people. Anyway, I looked at this puppy, and they're like, you know, they kind of talk. And the clerk working there is very smart. They said, sir, would you like to hold that dog? So they took us into what I think of now as the sucker room. Mm-hmm. And I held the dog, and the dog peed on me. So she marked her territory, and I called up a good friend of mine who actually had been in the Rama group. And I said, could you loan me $500? Because I didn't have any cash on me. And, you know, I just thought someone's going to come and buy this dog. So he said, yeah, I'll be there in a few minutes. Oh, and he shows up, he gives me $500. Yeah, he was the best man at my wedding. And he gives me $500, and I buy this dog, and I'm like scratching my head. The thing is, Jen, people think if you leave a cult that it all falls apart, and you need the cult leader for your dreams and for your inspiration and to have a great, full, mythological, larger than life. Guess what? You don't need them. You got it inside. So I just like, all right, I'm going to figure this out. So I built this trailer out of hay and all this little bed of hay and the pine needles, and the little Husky, when she'd run alongside my bicycle and she's tired, she'd go, so I'd say, okay, Nuna. Her name was Nunatak. I'd pick her up and put her in the trailer, and she'd like, and I would keep bicycling. Mm-hmm. The only bizarre bit was, I think the Husky was supposed to pull the human. So I think I may have gotten that backward. And we had a great journey. We went and saw America. And what a great metaphor for the heart. America is such a special place. And we went through Massachusetts, the great state of Massachusetts, and went past different universities in Amherst. And then we went into the great state of New York and went past Albany. And then I went to Syracuse, and all along I'm visiting friends and people I've not seen in a long time because I had joined a cult. So it's just a fascinating thing. And then up to New York, what did I do after New York? Let's see, upstate New York. Oh yeah, up to Michigan. Oh no, we went into Canada. I did a little loop into
you even went
Canada
into there.
where my cousin was getting married. So we went up a little bit into Canada, and then a little bit into Michigan, and then was Michigan, we did the Upper Peninsula. Actually, we did a lot of Michigan. Oh, it was just amazing. And then probably getting the order of this wrong. I'm sorry. I haven't looked at a map in a little bit. But we went into the through Michigan, and then the Upper Peninsula, and then Wisconsin. Great. Oh, Wisconsin is so beautiful, as is Michigan, and the hills, the Iron Hills is it, and then St. Ignace, and oh my gosh. Then from Wisconsin, it was Minnesota. Wow, what a beautiful, people so friendly, and Minnesota. Gosh, I should have looked at a map before I doing that. I think it was South Dakota, and then
So you
Wyoming.
took kind of the more northern route across, and then you ended up in California. Is that right?
I ended the trip. I was going through Colorado. No, I went past. Yeah, I ended up, the trip ended. I ended up hitchhiking across the desert, the Great Desert, because in the summer it's not a smart thing to bicycle with a Siberian Husky through the deserts.
And
so
you hitchhiked with your dog?
I hitchhiked from Walden. I think it was Walden, Colorado. So I went from Walden to Walden, and I hitchhiked to Berkeley, California. And I decided to finish my college degree.
What happened to your bicycle?
I still have it.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you brought it along hitchhiking too?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
I did. I put my thumb out, and a Beacon's moving van guy picked me up. And I helped him move furniture for a few days to thank him.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. So this was a massive kind of self-discovery retrospective, your trip across the United States. You were really kind of rediscovering yourself and who you were.
That's right. And it was the start of me writing my book, Take Me for a Ride. The book, my first book, Take Me for a Ride, is about this bicycle trip that I took across the country. And as I'm bicycling, I'm having memories of being in the right, the inner circle of this cult. So it's sort of like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's like these two threads come together in the narrative. So the bicycle trip was this reflecting and gathering material and the thoughts and actually, to be honest, the courage to write this book and to present that publicly. And also along the way, I'd stop and visit friends who had been in the group, or, friends who hadn't been in the group, and I would discuss this with them. And I remember going back to finish my college degree at UC San Diego, UCSD, University of California. And I remember I would just run into people on campus who knew me. I'd be walking around, hey, Mark. Like, oh, gosh, I haven't seen you in a while. And they say, you still, oh, yeah, all the time. It doesn't happen now. Of course, I live in Vermont, so people would talk to me about like what's happening with the group and things like that. And I'll never forget one woman who I really liked. We're friends. She did her PhD thesis on Rama, Frederick Lenz.
She did?
At UCSD. And she shared it with me. And I took her aside. I said, it's beautifully written. It's really well thought out. She's very, very, very smart person. And I said, there's only one problem. You weren't in the inner circle. You didn't know what the heck was happening.
Mm-hmm.
She was out in the audience.
And
Oh,
a
well.
very different perspective from the audience to the inner circle.
She didn't have the facts.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't have the facts. There is a thing, in my view, that, again, I mentioned this earlier about QAnon. There is a factual universe where you can point to something and say that happened. And then there's the imagination where I can imagine something happening, and maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Those are two separate things. Sometimes they converge, sometimes they don't. This is my worldview. A lot of people disagree with it. So I think it's important during this time with Trump in power, where to make this delineation, to not fall into the trap of being in a cult, because a cult leader will try to blur the line between fiction and nonfiction, because therein they gain power.
Mm-hmm.
Because then, if they have one's complete trust, they can fabricate anything they want. And there's no one in Missouri saying, show me, prove it. There's no checks and balances. And I guess with my friend who did the PhD, I was like, well, that's not quite right. But I think with Rama, Frederick Lenz, people had a sense of the facts, but a lot of people didn't know the facts because they weren't there. And the people in the inner circle knew the facts because they were physically there. And I think so too with Trump. For instance, Jen, did Trump say that people who were in the armed forces and they got killed in the United States Armed Forces, or they lost a limb, and he said they're losers? Did he or did he not say that? I believe he either said it or he didn't. If he said it, one cannot then say, he didn't say that, because if one does, that's called gaslighting. And that's messing with people's sense of reality. If you drop a brick and it lands on my foot, and we have video tape of it, and we have measurements, we have 6,000 people watching, and all kinds of measurements, and there's a big hole in my foot, or a big squished foot, for then to someone say, no, that didn't happen, that's called gaslighting. Trump is an expert at it. Rama was an expert at it. And I think that it's very important for people to understand that there is a physical, factual reality, because without that shared reality, then we're living in the world of George Orwell's 1984, where you can just have someone make shit up.
That's true. You know, that kind of reminds me of science, and how science is not as respected as it used to be. I mean, I view science as hard, cold facts. You know, that's the way things work. I'm a big climate change person. You know, I'm very active trying to share knowledge about things, and it's all based on science. Can you talk a little bit about the fall of science and how science is not respected very much anymore in some circles, and why that might be dangerous?
This is really important, Jan. And I tip my hat to you and your work with the climate issue, and working with scientists and educating the public. You're really good at it. I thank you for that. After I left the cult, I wrote my book. I was working on my book, and I decided to go to graduate school and get a master's in fine arts in creative nonfiction. So I got accepted I got a scholarship to a program at University of Pittsburgh, the oldest writing program in the United States. In its small circle, it's rather, I guess it's somewhat prestigious. So good for me. Good job, Marky. I left after 3 weeks.
Really?
I left my little scholarship and I said goodbye.
Why?
Because the first cult took 7 years to leave. The second took 3 weeks to leave.
Interesting.
And what happened was there is a philosophy from France called deconstructionism. In it, it is purported that words have no meaning. They only point to other words. There is no factual, physical reality. It's all subjective. Everyone has their own experience. It's all kind of touchy-feely thing. And it is, to me, a very destructive force that arrived here in the United States in the 70s with a man named Paul de Man, who is a professor at Yale. It came through Yale. A lot of things come through Yale. It's a center of great learning and great academic power, Yale University. Paul de Man came from Europe. And he spread this deconstructionist philosophy, which is just pointers pointing to pointers and pointing. It's rather than learning how to express oneself better and become a great writer and to use words to express facts and understanding, he was pointing out that words have no meaning. So everyone was like going in circles. It was found out that he was a Nazi empathizer.
Really?
He ditched his family in Europe, right? He had wife and kids and all this sort of thing. And he's restarted his life, and what a great way for a demagogue to hide their past and recreate themselves and to have no accountability for what one does or what one has done through the use of defusing the power of language. To me, I'm trying to respond to your very good, important question. To me personally, this was the start of it. My involvement with deconstructionism, where I left after 3 weeks and I said, I am sorry, I'm out of here. I'm going to write a book, Take Me for a Ride, that can help people. It points to real things. These words have meaning, shared meaning, significance. And all this new agey thing where it's all your reality is your reality and my reality is my reality. And there's no reality that is objective. I left that behind because it's bullshit. It's a great way to screw with people and take advantage of people. It is the cult leader's #1 tool. And it creates a disinformation bubble. All of my books, I have 3 books out. All of them are about disinformation bubbles. I'm sharing them all for free. Rama created a disinformation bubble where he scared everybody so much into believing his narrative that we couldn't accept facts from anyone else. There's no way to check what he said. It's all coming out of his imagination. Deconstructionism allowed this Nazi empathizer to hide his past, because when people interviewed him and say, wait a minute, we just found out this information, professor, that you have this incredible past. Can you discuss it? And you know what he said?
No.
He said words have no meaning. Blah, 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 blah. There's no accountability. In other words, if you're interviewing me, let's say you're a prosecutor and you're asking me questions, and you start saying, well, Mr. Laxer, where were you the night of da, 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 da? And I say, blah, 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 just words have no meaning. Blah, 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 blah. There's no accountability. No, I'm serious. It sounds silly, but this is academia in the United States at the top universities. Mm-hmm. So I left that program. It's probably not polite for me to give any signal with my hand of what I'm thinking right now. So I won't do it. I'll try to be respectful. So that's what Trump is doing. Trump is taking away, he's diffusing the power of the media and anyone who checks him, and he creates a fuzzy, blurry, new agey, hocus pocus deconstructionist view, which resonates. It's not a problem that he's doing it, Jen. The problem is it resonates with the American voters. That's the problem. America on the left, America on the right is primed for this type of autocratic rule because of deconstruction and things like it. And I'm so sorry. Blah, blah, blah. A good friend of mine told me, hey, Mark, if you ever interview, don't just talk. You have to have a back and forth. So I apologize. I'm like, blah, blah, blah. But I'm obviously passionate about it. Back to your point, science. This is all a way, everything I said, let's say, here it is. Everything I just said is right here. That's all a way to diffuse the power of science, which is what is, not just crazy shit that people are imagining.
Yeah. 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 The kind of like putting down of science and making it suspect, people, is black, or, I mean, people don't know the difference anymore. They're just like, it's amazing to me,
There's two thoughts I have about that. France and Russia. And by the way, I love France, so don't get me, I don't mean to be France bashing here. But the French, we sent them McDonald's, right? We've had this long back and forth with France from the very beginning. Are we going to be the United States more closely aligned with France, or is it with England, or the monarchy, or the revolution, the French Revolution? There's always this back and forth. And France, we send them McDonald's. It's not that they don't love us personally, but they don't necessarily love some bits of our culture. Yeah? It's kind of, what do? They sent us deconstructionism. And they're looking at us as we kind of, it jams up our system. So all our best thinkers, or many of our best thinkers at university, instead of doing anything of any importance, they're all masturbating intellectually, going nowhere. And they're like, that's number one. That's France. Number two, Russia. Vladimir Putin is not a big fan of American power. It is in his best interest, as he sees it, to diffuse the power of the United States. Better to do it without violence, because we probably kick their butts. And he's doing it. And how's he doing it? He's diffusing our power to accept science. And it's working. He's doing it through his good friend, virtually, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook.
Oh.
Not, they don't sit there and it's all winks and nods. And he's doing it through Trump. And the American people are ripe for it. Russia is deconstructing America through the Republican Party, which is so bizarre because Ronald Reagan so much would not have liked this. Reagan stood against the Russian autocracy. He was not a big fan of that super steep demagoguery coming out of the Kremlin. He was not a fan of that. And that's what the Republican Party, which is what George Conway is trying to say, if anyone would listen to him. The Republican Party does not stand for this, let's have Trump deconstruct our ability to not accept science. And look what it's done with this pandemic. And look what it's done with our ability to think straight. As I say, Jen, and this all comes back to your comment about science, France, Russia. There's a bigger meta story here happening.
So the France part I didn't really know about, but the science thing, I've taken that very personally, and probably so do so many other people who use science as the basis of their kind of reality touchstone, you know? Mm-hmm. And once you start to invalidate that reality touchstone, it's like there's nothing for sure in reality anymore, because you've just said, like, this whole scientific thing not really happening, you know, and that's kind of the basis for physical reality.
I think people who have been in cults, speaking about myself now, are more sensitive to and adhere more to and hold on to the precepts of science, because it is a touchstone for reality. Because some of us, like I have experienced my worldview shifting so that the touchstone was one narcissistic, charismatic sociopath. His imagination became the touchstone of my reality, where there's no checks and balances. Now I'm seeing that was just with a few thousand people. Now I'm seeing it happening with millions of people, with the leader of the United States. Same thing. And what I'm saying to the American people, if anyone out there is listening, let's go back. Let's go back to science, because it's safer. If there's a pandemic, we don't want to be putting household detergents inside our limbs and injecting that sort of thing. I trust the scientists. Scientists make a lot of mistakes. Their whole worldview is based on purposely making mistakes, but they learn from them, and they do it over and over again. And they learn how physical reality works. Mm-hmm. And if they find out, oops, we make mistakes, they stay honest. There's a transparency about it. It's a healthier model to base one's world on and one's government on than a cult leader who has become destructive.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that's been very distressing for me about this whole Trump administration is the deconstruction of diplomacy and the deconstruction of the State Department and our relationships with countries and leaders around the world. You know, this has thrown everybody for a loop. But America, when I was growing up, had so much goodwill attached to it. And I grew up overseas, and I saw you know, America was held in really high regard. And, you know, we were kind of like the peacemakers and, you know, the project doers and all sorts of other things. I mean, we did a lot of bad things as well. No question about it. But there was a real sense of diplomacy and working with other countries and diplomatic ties. And that just pretty much got trashed, you know, over the last 4 years.
So Jen, I don't know if you remember in high school, I don't know if you went through the same thing. There were bullies.
Yeah.
There were bullies in high school. And those are the people who are in charge now. It was the bullies, the people who are abusive. And they're opening the door for those people in society who hate to gain a large voice. And that's what's happening. And up is down and down is up. This is what makes great literature, by the way. You have the triangle, you study this in literature when you're writing, is you have the triangle of normalcy. You know, King Lear, you know, king's up here. And then as the story progresses, everything turns on its head and the fool becomes the wise person. The king becomes the fool and stuff. And then hopefully it inverts back again. So right now, Trump is trying to, you know, he'd love to disband NATO. He sees England and France and Australia and New Zealand, place like that, Germany, our allies, are very, very, Canada, are very, very important allies, Mexico, as our enemies. And he sees our I don't know about our enemies, but regimes who would love to destroy us. He looks up to them.
Mm-hmm.
That in and of itself is not a problem. The problem is that there's half the country right now today who approve of that. Why do I say that? Because they're going to vote for him, and he very well may win this next election. People love a good, destructive cult leader. People like to be told what to do. They like certainty. And I think it's a species-wide problem. I don't think it's just those Germans in the 30s and the 40s. No, I don't believe that. I think it's brewing right here in America. And if those bullies keep gaining voice and power and hardware, people say it can't happen here. Bullshit. It happens when good people do nothing. And I see my friends who can share stories, and all the people I know, not everyone, but a lot of people I know, it's just kind of passive. And that's how people are. That's why the wolves in society can do what they do. Because people let them. So go out and vote.
Absolutely.
Take this guy on, people. Stand up. If you're a Republican, good. I respect you. This is danger. Let's reset things. And then you want to vote, get another Republican, fine. That's, you know, we'll see who wins. But right for this election, we need to step back from the precipice, because I've seen what it's like on that other side, and it's pretty ugly.
Well, I sure hope that everybody will make a, valiant attempt to vote this year. Here in Colorado, we have mail-in voting, universal mail-in vote. We haven't had any problems with it. We've had it for about 8 years or so, and it's a great system, and it really makes people vote. And there's no problems with it. But even if you don't have mail-in voting, make the attempt to go, and if you have to stand in a line or whatever, but we have to make our voice be heard.
Absolutely. What a treat to talk with you, Jan.
Absolutely. It's been a treat to talk with you too, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, the first time I saw darling Corey, she was standing by my bed. Oh, baby, strapped